Hi, I want to talk about absent grief. It's when you experience minimal emotional distress following a significant loss. It can be so confusing because in experiencing this the tense emotion of in grief, only to find that you're just totally numb. We call it absent grief. The grief is not there. It is eluding you and you don't understand why. It's often thought that this comes out of shock, or because we are avoiding the grief, we're resisting the grief, or we're pushing back on the pain. We can't let it in. Sometimes we have such difficulty facing the painful emotion. The reality of what has happened to us in this loss is not coming into my life. And so we're almost shocked. We're like, man, this is not as bad as I thought it was going to be. There's no single cause for this type of experience. It happens to some people and it doesn't happen to others. What I find is that over time, the numbness starts to wear off. And it wears off a little bit at a time. Could you imagine if what has just happened to you were to hit you all at once? I promise you, you'd be on the ground in a fetal position. But instead, what happens to us, we have this built-in protection mechanism where the numbness takes over. And it allows us little bits and pieces of grief in throughout a time. It's just a little bit will seep in. Where we get into the danger zone is where we start to avoid the grief altogether. When we come upon a grieving experience, we're going to do one of four things. We're going to resist. We're going to avoid. We're going to react to that grief. We can overreact or underreact, right? We're going to walk around like the grief didn't happen and pretend like it didn't happen. And we can get stuck in any of those. All of these comes from our absent grief. Sometimes right in the beginning, we get so busy doing the funeral and making all the plans that we don't allow the grief in. We need to look at it little bits and pieces of a time. And when it does seep in, and it will, and when it comes in, we need to allow the grief to be there, even for just that moment. So that means if I go and sit and cry for 5 minutes, that's what I needed to do today. That's what I need to do. I promise you that absent grief will dissipate over time, but where we don't want to get caught up into is allowing it to be 1 year, 2 years, 3 years later. We want to go after it as soon as possible. The earlier you go after it, the better you're going to be, the better prepared, and the better victory you're going to have of healing your broken heart.